Hello, we are Michael Hall and Kayla Johnson, and we are going to be talking about trends in conservation research.
I'm going to be discussing problem-based approaches towards conservation. Between, oh, oops, 1,978 articles were selected randomly from between 1980 to 2019, and they were searched for phrases problem and solution, and it was found that there was a much greater bias towards problem-based approaches, which makes sense because this was the first way that researchers thought to handle the issue of conservation. To understand the solution, you must first understand the problem. So, in this way, it makes sense that problem based approaches were the first method introduced. Problem based studies aim to understand the main anthropogenic drivers associated with biodiversity and loss. So, problem based research on habitat loss and fragmentation focuses on characterizing how different features of altered landscapes, like habitat amount, fragment size, and isolation, edge effects, matrix permeability, and landscape scale processes affect biodiversity. Typically, it considers effects of habitat loss and fragmentation on species occurrence, biomass, and diversity. Maps, Geographic Information System, GIS, and remote sensing tools can be used to estimate these habitat loss rates. The majority of habitat loss is caused by human activity. One example of GIS technology being used to monitor habitat change and decline is in the South American temperate rainforest. Alternative landscape metrics can differ by each particular conservation situation, but it can include proportion of suitable habitat, spatial autocorrelation, proportion of habitat boundaries, and proportion of habitat non-habitat boundaries. Taking notice of populations that are declining is relatively easy, especially when the approach is more to point out that the change has taken place as opposed to offering solutions. And population declines may eventually lead to species extinction. And another facet of problem based conservation is recording when the last of a species dies. This image depicts just one type of habitat loss that includes destruction, fragmentation, or degradation of habitat. It's the primary threat to the survival of wildlife worldwide. Activities like harvesting natural resources, industrial production, and urbanization are large human contributions to habitat destruction. Scientists can use algorithms to predict areas that may be more at risk for being attacked by invasive species. Problem based biological invasion research focuses on characterization of negative effects of alien species on native populations, communities, and ecosystems. The effects of non native species on native populations include increased competition for limited resources, preying on those native populations, altering habitats, and greatly shifting ecosystems. This research covers local lists of invasive species, competitive performance, and impact on those mutualistic networks. Furthermore, beyond descriptions of present spatial distribution patterns, ecological niche modeling is used to predict geographic spread of alien species. Invasive plant species include Japanese knotweed, kudzu, creeping buttercup, wisteria, poison hemlock, and many more. Invasive animal species include zebra mussels, common carp, Burmese pythons, koipu, wild boar, cane toad, and more. Invasive species are aided by climate change, increased trade, and land use changes. They can wreak havoc in ecosystems where they settle and they kill local species and act as pests. Problem based research on exploitation covers the direct exploitation of natural renewable resources and overhunting of animals. Overhunting, overfishing, bycatch, and overexploitation of plant resources are important research areas. Many studies focus on resource depletion, extinction of exploited species, cascading effects, and deterioration of human health and economy. So, bycatch is the unintentional mortality of non target species. And there are various methods for estimating bycatch. Those include fishery independent surveys, self reporting, at sea observation through observers and digital video cameras, and stranding networks. All of those methods may contribute to estimating those bycatch numbers, but at sea observation is the best mechanism to get reliable and accurate estimates. Cascading effects are also called knock on, and they can particularly apply if exploitation causes a habitat to lose its apex predator. Due to the loss of this top predator, there's a dramatic increase in prey species, which in turn can overexploit their own food sources until the population of that animal dwindles, possibly to the point of extinction. Every year, fishing bycatch kills more than 250,000 loggerhead and leatherback turtles, more than 100 million sharks, as shown here, and at least 300,000 small whales and dolphins. The shrimping industry is one of the most notorious for this. In addition to killing more animal species than intended, trawlers scour seabeds. That ruins the structural integrity for many of the species that live there. Problem-based pollution research typically analyzes the release of organic or inorganic substances into the environment and the detrimental effects that those substances have on biological organisms, including people. It also investigates the effect that those pollutants may have on biological communities and ecosystems through the direct toxic effects on organisms, species interactions, and processes. A major line of this research is in the analysis of direct toxicity of a pollutant on a target organism. That they do this to determine the LD50 or lethal dose 50, the lethal dose in which 50% of the population will die due to exposure of this toxin. Biomagnification is also known as bioamplification or biological magnification. It's any concentration of a toxin, like pesticides, in the tissues of organisms that becomes successively higher in higher levels of the food chain. So it increases. Environmental pollution takes many forms. It can take the form of air pollution, water pollution, and land pollution. Air pollution occurs as chemicals are released into the air through harmful gases, burning of fuels, and other byproducts of human life. Polluted air can impede the breathing, and it can cause serious diseases in humans and animals alike. Water pollution happens when there are toxins from humans and industrial wastes. Those toxins are introduced into water supplies. Water can be a medium for many pathogens in addition to toxins. It can create diseases in animals and humans if consumed, in addition to killing plants in which require those water sources to survive. Land pollution happens when waste materials are left to accumulate on the Earth's surface. They can include fertilizers and pesticides that are absorbed into soil. Ingestion of these waste products can injure or poison animals. The chemicals can also be absorbed by plants or leach into the water supply. Problem-based climate research uses predicted temporal changes on global and regional temperature, rainfall, carbon dioxide, and methane concentrations to model changes on individual performance, population spatial distribution and phenology, community structure, or ecosystem functioning and services. Experimental studies on the subject have been developed in small-scale field experiments, greenhouses, and microcosms. Climate change includes both global warming driven by human induced emissions of greenhouse gases and the resulting large scale shifts in weather patterns. The effects of global warming can be seen in their impacts on the environment. They include ecological collapse, such as the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reefs and reefs worldwide, extreme weather. This includes drought, high temperatures, and difficult to control wildfires, Arctic warming, permafrost thaws, and that undermines infrastructure and it releases greenhouse gases like methane into the environment. As the permafrost is thawing, habitats are destroyed that Arctic animals need to survive. As the ice melts, animals like polar bears are losing their places to live. And finally, pest propagation. Mild winters allow pine beetles and other pests to survive and kill large areas of land. Thank you, and here are my references.
All right, I'm going to be talking about the solution-based conservation part of this paper. So as we discussed, the problems have been more than looked into. There's a lot of research done in the first 20 or so years of this conservation research that they kind of have started moving forward with these solution-based methods and doing research on how successful and what kind of consequences there are for their actions, what their solutions are. It's not to say that there is not still discussion on how problematic these other things are on these individual populations or species, but it's more now that they need to find out how to solve that problem. So for habitat loss, one thing that they are really trying to do is acknowledge this fragmentation that's occurring as the human race is growing larger and taking up more space. The animals and the plants, they need this space as well. So once they are fragmented into these different subpopulations, they are now trying to create like a stepping stone or a landscape corridor between these different groups where they will feel safe traveling in between the populations and allow for them to diversify their genetic, their alleles between these groups instead of being so separated and causing a bottleneck. One thing that is also important in this topic is the national park services throughout the world, which are creating sustainable habitats for animals and plants to be without being able to be interrupted as cities get larger, as we need to cut down more trees, but you can't do that in a protected land. Another is the ecosystem restoration programs that are all throughout the world, trying to repair some of the damage that we have done throughout our time. And this would be repairing waterways, repairing a place, a forest, a swamp. I know they're doing restoration for certain species of Chinese crocodiles, and that have all but gone extinct, except for in captivity. Another example of this is research being done in Scandinavia on the Arctic foxes, which had experienced fragmentation due and over hunting that led to them being down to about 40 animals in the early 90s, and then being brought back through different means like creating corridors between zones. So biological invasion is what happens when you are bringing a non-native animal or plant to an area where they are just a little bit more fit. And this often occurs due to pet trade or planting of some type of plant that is just far more suited than other plants. One example of that is with bamboo. Bamboo is planted here very often because it looks beautifully, but it is extremely invasive and will outfight other plants in the area. Another example of that is the zebra, the lionfish pictured here at the bottom, where they were brought in, especially in the 90s and the late 80s, where they looked beautiful and they were brought in for an aquarium. And however, aquariums are very expensive and it is hard to maintain. So a lot of people ended up just dropping their aquariums off at the beach, where the lionfish, which is toxic, is a very strong predator and nothing can really beat it out in its predatory ways in this area. So now there are way too many in Florida. And one way that they have been able to stop this, and it is one of the major ways that you can fight biological invasion, is through culling, laws for incentivizing the hunting or fishing of a certain type of animal. This is also done in Australia with the feral cat population, which has been diminishing their species of birds. And another thing is the prevention of through laws. So you have exotic animal laws in all of America. So you can see the different types that range from outright banning of private ownership all the way to where the state has no specific laws on owning an exotic animal, but they kind of leave it up to the county and or cities. And how effective this is varying. Overexploitation, again, as Kayla had mentioned, is just harvesting or hunting of a specific species or plant or animal until the point where they cannot maintain their own population in the wild any longer. A big example of that is with the shellfish populations, especially the freshwater mussels. And there's a lot of research being done on trying to maintain these populations in the wild, but also one way to do that is to supplement with captive breeding of these animals or plants, where they will grow them in an environment that is well suited for them to be reintroduced into the natural environment. One thing that is kind of more of a theoretical process currently, but a lot of people are still talking about this, is de-extinction. This is something you'll probably recognize with the woolly mammoth, where they're hoping to be able to use elephants as a vector to bring back the woolly mammoth in some way. However, that is kind of far off, but what they are currently doing right now is hopefully bringing back species such as the southern white rhino through the northern white rhino, which they are kind of extinct in the wild completely, the southerns, and they may be able to bring them back in that way. So now we're going to get to pollution and climate change, which there are possibilities for things, but again, this is a lot more theoretical. They're kind of, as it is a political, it is a political topic that makes things a little more difficult sometimes. So there are a lot of laws that are hopefully going to be done or will be done eventually that could help with pollution management as well as climate change. Though it seems that it's mostly to be fighting or come even with the amount of pollution that we provide yearly. There is a very interesting thing that has been done with the use of plants, which is just replanting these specific types of plants in areas that have either water or soil pollution, where it's metals or toxic materials in the water or in the dirt, and they will uptake the metals or the toxic material and they will use it for growth. One specifically that stood out to me was sunflowers, where they have been using sunflowers to clear arsenic from the soil, and that's shown a lot of promise. there's potentials for using bacteria for this very same thing, and that could be very successful. And then, of course, there was other technologies that they're hoping to develop in order to clean air and clean waters and soils. For climate change, again, this is very theoretical. One very interesting technology that I saw while doing this research was a carbon capture system that would take carbon from the air and almost shuttle it down into the earth underneath the impermeable cap. And what this could do in terms of any downsides, I don't know. And I don't know that it has been completely found out yet. It has not been discovered. It's just very theoretical, and that could be useful in terms of bringing CO2, the greenhouse gases from the air, and getting them someplace safer. Another option on that is that has been done now is just planting more trees in places. A lot of organizations have come together to try to just plant more trees, because that is the most natural way of cleaning the air. It will use the CO2. However, at the rates that trees are being cut down in the rainforest and a lot of other countries, and the trying to make farmland and stuff like that, it is a very difficult challenge to try to completely cancel it out, let alone come even. And there's got to be a lot more research and some type of answer to this very difficult question coming soon. These are my references that I used, and that is all.